Hey, welcome back to Water Cooler Politics. We have a guest today, which is unusual. My lovely wife, Becky, will tell you who it is.
Want to introduce to you Mr. Ken W. Good. He graduated from Hardin-Simmons University in 1982 with a Bachelor of Arts degree. He received a Master of Education degree in 1986 from Tarleton State University, a part of the Texas A&M system. In 1989, he received his law degree from Texas Tech School of Law, where he was a member of the Texas Tech Law Review. Mr. Good has argued cases before the Supreme Court of Texas and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, along with numerous courts of appeals, including the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Mr. Good is married and has two daughters.
Ken, welcome to Water Cooler Politics.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you for the very nice introduction.
Ken, I think there's going to be three issues in this election cycle that are going to be on voters' minds. I think one, of course, is the border and immigration. The other is the economy and inflation. And I think the other is crime. Crime has really skyrocketed since the pandemic. We have seen a movement across the country for no cash bail. And we've seen that here in St. Louis and in other cities. Give us a quick overview, if you can, of this movement and how it began.
Ooh, that's a really good question. I would argue that this movement began, 4 or 5 election cycles ago, where one side of the spectrum of the politicians would come out 6 months before the election and they would say, there's a segment of the population that's being mistreated and you're being mistreated by the criminal justice system. And so you need to get angry and you need to come out and vote in higher numbers. And then as soon as the election was over, you went back to status quo. And I think that segment of the electorate started realizing, hey, you're not really changing anything. You're saying that all these things are wrong. And so they started electing the true believers that were pushing for reforms, whether they were actually called for or not. And I think that has now taken a toehold and it has built, especially in our urban areas. You can see politicians calling for defund the police, and then they've now walked back that, and they try to walk it back on the south side. So I would argue right now we've got politicians who are boxed in our urban areas because they've had several years of saying you've been mistreated, several years of saying that we need to defund the police. And so now we've seen crime as a result take off, because even if you say that these people were well-intentioned, the policies that have been acted have tied the hands of judges so they can't address organized crime, career criminals, or gangs. And so when they realize, hey, we're tying the hands of all these elected officials, well, then suddenly they take off because they figure out different ways to make a ton of money at it. And the best example that I have to support my theory is what's going on in Illinois, because, they had the Safety Act. And then we've been hearing for the last 6 months, the Illinois Supreme Court is going to declare that unconstitutional. And so we're going to still have cash bail, which is different than surety bail. They got rid of surety bail years before that. And I think what happened is the politicians were counting on the Supreme Court of Illinois to give them the cover of protecting, getting them out of the box. And I think what the Supreme Court of Illinois just did in the last couple of weeks was essentially saying, don't come to us to get you out of the box. If you're in a box, you need to get out of it yourself, because their ruling was so contrary to stare decisis, to what we know under the law, that they're just saying, look, this is a problem you've created. You need to get out of it. Don't count on us to do it and ruin our political careers because of the box you've created.
Yeah, and I think that, and you said in your remarks that you think this happened about 4 or 5 election cycles, and I agree with that. I think it coincides with the Michael Brown incident and the Ferguson uprising, because here in St. Louis, we basically, in our municipality, St. Louis is divided between the St. Louis city, and then you have St. Louis County, and St. Louis County is divided up into 100 and something different municipalities with their own police forces. And what the Michael Brown incident exposed to everyone is that in these municipalities, you basically had debtor prisons where people had minor traffic accidents or, municipal ordinance violations. And some of them, they didn't have the bail to pay. And some of them would be in jail for like 3 or 4 months in these little small municipalities because of these small violations. And I think with Michael Brown, that's when that really started getting highlighted. that cash bail needs to be maybe reformed, but this getting rid of it is absolutely nuts, in my opinion. And I'm glad that you brought up the Illinois Supreme Court, because that was something that I was going to ask you about. According to this, under the new law, judges across Illinois will not require those charged with a crime to post bail in order to leave the jail while they await trial. However, those who are considered to be a threat to the public or are likely to flee will be required to stay in jail. What's the line dividing on who should stay and who's not? Who's going to make that decision?
Well, first of all, let me say, they're saying no one will be required to give bail. They haven't had surety bail, the private industry for multiple years. So what they had left was what we would call a 10% bail, where they could pay 10% of the premium to the court, or they could post a cash bond, which would be the full amount of the bond in cash. The problem is the Illinois trial courts, if you didn't show up, they were using that money for court operations. And so now we've completely destroyed the courts in Illinois, because their failure to appear rates were a lot higher anyway, because they didn't have the private industry. So we had chaos. Now we've gotten rid of part of their funding source, because they're not going to be able to use cash bonds or 10% when they fail to appear. So they were running their criminal justice system already based upon the failures of people to show up for court. So they couldn't really punish them. They needed to give them a new bond so they could not show up again, so they could take that money for court operations. So I think that's part of the problem, is we were setting up a system that was doomed to failure to begin with, because we're taking out accountability. And the chaos it creates forces two things. It forces decriminalization of crime or discounting punishment on crime. So you were seeing people committing murders and they were getting 10 years, 5 years, just so they could get it pled off the books and go on to the next case. It creates a completely dysfunctional criminal justice system. And so it's going to get worse. It's going to get even worse in Illinois now, because they didn't make up the funding that the courts are losing. So they have less money and they have no accountability. And so they're trying to mirror the federal system. The problem with that is there is no state that can mirror the federal system, because the federal system detains 70-something% of the people that are arrested. So we've got this little game going on. Oh, we're going to detain the people that are really dangerous. You don't have the ability to do that. And even if you did, you're giving up all accountability on anything like a misdemeanor. You might as well just give up on misdemeanors. I mean, let's compare California. I did a podcast with a DA in California. They have a similar system on misdemeanors. 80% of the people required to come to court do not show up on misdemeanors, and there's nothing they can do to force them. They can't punish them. I mean, until they agree to come, that you can't even go forward with their case. That's where we're headed in Illinois, because there's not even enough room in the state of Illinois to hold the really dangerous people. And that category is going to continue to grow as they see no accountability.
So have you had any studies? I mean, it's really easy to say, oh, well, crime's gone up because we're seeing more arrests, or the first 20 minutes of the news is just saying more things. Have you seen any studies that prove this out?
Yes. The answer to your question is yes, there are studies that bear this out. And we've gotten the benefit of the pandemic, because during the pandemic, I kind of call that period as we tried bail reform on steroids. And as a result of that period in time, we have a lot of information that's now coming out. We have a couple of reports from Yolo County in California from the district attorney's office. So, and he did a comparison of people released on zero bail, which is the equivalent, simple release is what I call that, 10% bail, those are all simple release where there's no accountability. There's nothing, no one looking over your shoulder. And he compared those to people released on surety bonds, and the numbers were just astounding. People released on zero bail, no accountability, simple release, had over a 70% higher chance of committing further crime during the next 18 months versus if they were released on a surety bond. I mean, they had over a 200% greater chance of committing a violent offense. So talking about, we're only going to maintain or detain violent offenders. Well, everyone that you've got that are going to be released, they've got a 200% chance of, in the next period of time, of committing a violent offense versus if they had been released on a surety bond, which Illinois got rid of years ago. So they have set up a system for complete failure. And then we would say New York has also confirmed that. Their bail reform went into effect at the very beginning of the pandemic, and within 6 months during the middle of the pandemic, when nobody was meeting, they did their first rollback. And now they've since done 3 or 4 rollbacks of their bail reform. Because it's just not working. It's just creating chaos, and you can see it across the country. I mean, suddenly you've got crime increasing, and career criminals just have no. I mean, they have no fear anymore. And then the last thing I would point to is News Nation did a town hall meeting in the last week, talking about crime in the urban cities as a part of it, and there was a Democrat mayor that was like, "Look, guys. The only thing that's going to get people to come to court is surety bail. And until you have something to replace it with that will have accountability, then everything you're doing, you're just going to create more crime." And then also, I guess I said that was the last thing, but I would include one more thing. In the last 2 weeks, the NAACP in Oakland issued a letter blasting the local officials for crime and for the defund the police movement, and have demanded a state of emergency to address crime. And, the DA, Democrat DA said, "Oh, this is a shame. This is, they're misguided." The regional NAACP came out and supported the NAACP. So you have now the NAACP attacking the very politicians that they originally supported, saying crime is running amok. You see the fruit from it now. You see businesses closing. We can't sustain $25,000 a day in shoplifting.
John, I got a softball question for you here. Did we really need a study to show that violent criminals, if you don't give them bail and they're out on the street, that a great percentage of them will probably reoffend? Do we really need a study to tell us that?
You know what? I think in this day and time we do, because, we've been inundated with stuff saying, hey, we can release more criminals and we'll be safer. I mean, we've been hearing that from like California. Oh, yeah, we've got an overcrowding problem in the prison system, so we'll release more prisoners and we'll still be safe. We'll be safer. And then we've got studies. If you Google "do not prosecute misdemeanors," we've got stuff from like 4 or 5 years ago, maybe less, that say, here's a study that says if we don't prosecute misdemeanors, we'll have less crime. Well, that's only true if you then say these are not crimes anymore. I mean,
they'll commit felonies. They won't commit misdemeanors. They'll commit felonies.
And that's what we've discovered. That's what the reality is. But you go, if it doesn't sound right, if it doesn't make common sense, then it's not right. I mean, I think that's one of the lessons.
So how do we find I know maybe their hearts were in the right place when they started this, and they said, okay, well, there's people that end up waiting for trial that aren't really that bad. And if they could just have a bail and then go back to work, they're going to keep being successful. There's got to be a happy medium between penalizing them and letting everybody out.
I agree. There needs to be a happy medium, but we are so far apart from any medium. We've got one extreme and then we go to the other extreme, and we don't seem to be able to find compromise. And, I talked to somebody about the DC system, and he made a good point. The First Step Act that Trump passed, it's been criticized because it makes across the board release. It doesn't review people individually to determine, hey, have you decided to become a productive citizen? Are you now willing to not commit more crime? It just isn't across the board. And the point he made was the government's not good at individual assessing people. It is. And it's so expensive to do that. And so, but they're really good about cross the board stuff. And so the problem that we're seeing in, I think, part of the criminal justice reform is that very issue. They can't spend the money. They're not willing to do that because the part of the coalition is to save money. And so they can't do this individual assessment because it's just too expensive. And so they're looking for across the board things. That's the reason why they don't want to look at your criminal history. They just want to say, if you're charged with theft, you will get released on no bond, or you'll be released on zero bail, or you'll be released on a personal bond. All types are examples of simple release, no matter how many times you've done it. That's the problem. Nobody wants to look at criminal histories. That's what judges do. They look at your criminal history and say, okay, this is theft, but you have a 5-year criminal history of theft. You don't need to be getting out of jail. You're not a first-time offender. You don't have a job. Your job is theft. Right. And so, the problem we have in our criminal justice system is it's based on this concept of we're going to give you the just enough pressure to get you to turn, so we don't have you in the criminal justice system anymore. And the first-time offender is very different. They don't need much pressure. But as you go through the system and become a career criminal, you need more and more pressure. That's what we're really fighting over right now, if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to treat anyone differently, no matter how many times they've been arrested for the same offense, because we've decided that's a low-level offense. And as you've commented, if you do that, then you're encouraging people to commit more and more crime and more vicious crime. And that's what we're seeing.
Get ready to uncork a new adventure with Wild Wine Life host Ray Maxwell as he uncovers the perfect pairing of delicious wine and the great outdoors. From hunting and fishing to foraging, Ray takes you on a unique culinary journey that will leave your taste buds singing. Catch all of Ray's Wild Wine Life videos on the Wild Wine Life Facebook page at facebook.com/wildwinelife, all one word, and savor the memories, flavors, and adventure of Wild Wine Life. And unfortunately, there are Soros-supported prosecutors like we had here in St. Louis of Kim Gardner, who honestly believe that their job is not to protect the public and put people in jail, but it is to coddle and save the criminal from the police. That seems to be their mindset. Ken, I want to apologize to you in advance for asking you to get into the mind of a liberal, but what do you think is really behind this no cash bail movement? I personally believe it is more than just criminal justice, but I want to get your thoughts.
Well, first I would say it's a coalition. So to make a majority, part of the coalition wants to decriminalize certain crime. All misdemeanors should be decriminalized. And some of the coalition wants chaos because that will, in effect, create decriminalization.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there are some honest, good-hearted people that repeat some of the things that have been said today. They don't want poor people to be held in jail because they can't afford to get out on a bond, but they also and so they're agreeing with the coalition to create rules. But the problem is those rules are now tying the hands of judges so they can't address gangs, career criminals, or organized crime. And that's the problem. That's the fallacy. I think there's some in that coalition that's exactly what they want. Now, I think part of the coalition, there are politicians that are coming to realize what's going on, but they're in a box. I mean, how do you get out of a box that you've created yourself when if you even stand up a little bit, you're going to get opposed, and you're going to get opposed strongly by some Soros-funded candidate. So until we get through this period, because I think we're seeing a little infighting starting to show up where we see politicians say, this can't continue. This is bad for public safety. This is bad for our community. And I think that will continue to grow.
Do you honestly think they're going to recognize that it's their decisions that are causing these problems and not blame it on something else, for example, like gun control?
You see the blaming on gun control already, but here's what I think. This is what we're doing now is not sustainable. So we have to have a course change at some point, whether that will be through the current politicians, which I hope it is, because, we've always been a law and order country. This is kind of out of the ordinary. I believe, you could argue that we're just repeating the same cycle that we did in the 60s where we felt safe. We were more forgiving in our laws. We released more people, crime increased. And so then we had a backlash. So you could argue that we're repeating the same mistakes, but the pendulum has swung so hard and so fast. But the problem we have is, in the last election, 2 weeks before the last national election, almost 2 years ago, one side of the electorate came out and said, "Oh, we don't have a crime problem. This is all made up. This is not real. This is something made up by our opponents." Now you've got the NAACP issuing a letter attacking local politicians. So this election cycle, it's going to be hard. And in the future one, the next one, it's going to be hard to deny that there is a crime problem in our inner cities when you've got those groups coming out and saying it. And I will just kind of end with this kind of comment on the commercial properties fiasco that is coming, because we have 50% vacancy rate in our urban cities. The bankruptcies that are coming if we can't provide a safe work environment for people to go to in those areas is going to hit really hard in a few years.
Mm-hmm. Ken, we were talking about Illinois reforming their bail system. Other states, are doing the same. California, where we were talking about that study, Congressman Representative Ted Lieu He sponsored back in 2021 HR 1249, the No Money Bail Act. I just want to read you a little bit from it and get your comments on it. This bill restricts the use of money bail, of course, the payment of money as a condition of pretrial release in criminal cases. Specifically, it prohibits the use of money bail in federal criminal cases. Additionally, it makes a state that uses a money bail system ineligible for funds under the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistant Grant Program.
Well, I would say it didn't pass.
Thank God.
And I would say that's, the problem we have in our states and in our federal government right now is we are electing people from the extremes of both parties. And we're setting up voting restrictions, or we're taking away voting restrictions that pushes people to the middle. Look at the federal government. Congress used to have, this filibuster rule, and we've started limiting it and limiting it and limiting it. Now we've pretty much gotten rid of it. Well, what does that do? That pushes people to the extremes, because those extreme policies could never pass when we had the filibuster. So that's why we're seeing more intervention by the courts, because you see an extreme policy and then courts get involved, and they're really kind of being asked, like the state of Illinois, I think they're being asked, save us from just pure politics, save us from the politicians who realize what they're doing is crazy, and they're hoping that you will protect us because their politics requires them to do this. And you're going to see some courts get involved, like you saw the U.S. Supreme Court on the issue of forgiving student debt that was outside of anything that the president had the authority to do, and which he even said he didn't have the authority to do it at one point, but he did it anyway when the politics required it. And so you're going to see that on a larger and larger scale. And you're going to see courts that say, okay, we're going to get involved. You're going to see courts saying, don't come to us with this problem, solve it yourself. And so that's kind of where I see the future for now. And you're going to see states that we've already have seen states roll back. Alaska has rolled back some of their reforms. New York has rolled back. You're going to see more of that, but you're still seeing states push for it too. It's just crazy. You've got Texas that is pushing for criminal justice reform, but it's from the opposite direction. Mm-hmm. It's pushing for a stronger accountability, not weaker. And so you've got this big disparity between the states on approaches, depending on one political philosophy versus another. And as long as you've got people fleeing states because they don't feel safe, going to states that are strengthening their criminal justice system, that doesn't make sense to me. And that can't continue. Yeah. And we're going to have states that are, they're already blaming when a business closes. Oh, this is terrible. Why can't they trust take care of our voters? Well, they can't take care of your voters because you're not willing to take care of them.
I saw and we're about to wrap up here, Ken. I saw just an incredible statistic talking about downtown office vacancies since the pandemic. Everyone was working at home and wasn't going to the office. New York has gotten up to, I think, 67%, which is still pretty low. San Francisco's 32% is their occupancy rate in downtown San Francisco. That just absolutely blows my mind. And we know why, because the criminals are running amok. You can steal as much as you want as long as it's not over a certain amount. You don't go to jail. No accountability whatsoever.
Well, the chickens are running the chicken coop is what we'd say in my town or my family. The politicians know what they're doing. A 30% occupancy rate, they know what the result of that is. But you can see so much evidence of this. Their tax revenues going down, their property tax values are going down. So all those revenues coming in is reducing. And so they're going to have to increase taxes just to provide the same level of service, not to expand it. And so we're saving money because we're defunding the police. No. Look at Portland. Portland is the best example I can give you. Mm-hmm. We came up with a proposal to decriminalize heavy drugs. And we're going to spend all that money on services. Well, less than 0.01% have elected for services. You've got a record number of people overdosing on drugs and dying every week or every month. And, the law enforcement can't do anything about it. People, it's just like an open opium den in Portland, Oregon. And there's no way to force people into drug treatment because we've removed all accountability. And so, we are hoping, they've set up a system where we're just, okay, you want to commit suicide? Okay, we'll reduce our population and our tax burden by you just killing yourself or overdosing on drugs.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That was not the promise that was made to the public. And they have broken every promise they've made, and no one's holding them accountable, just like no one's holding the drug addicts accountable. But just like we know, if I have a choice between doing drugs or going to rehab, if you can't force me to go to rehab, I'm not going. I'm going to continue using drugs. And with fentanyl, I read an article the other day that said I can get high on fentanyl for less than $5 for a couple of hours. So it's the drug of choice in the urban cities.
The number one killer of young people, according to the CDC, 18 to 30, I think, like that. The number one cause of death for them is fentanyl overdose. Insane.
Well, how do we fix our urban cities, though? We've our urban cities have already failed families. They've already failed schools. They've already failed drugs because there's such drug overdoses and drug dependency. And in the last couple of years, we've had all these fires and these protests, you want to call them riots, and burning down buildings. So they have less economic opportunity. I mean, it looks like I read something that said the red states are becoming redder, but the blue urban cities are becoming bluer because the only people left are the people that vote blue.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Missouri is completely living that out. 100%. Ken, thank you so much for your time. This has been interesting and mildly depressing, but also I think there is hope based on what you were saying. Is there anything you would like us to promote, anything that you've written or anything like that?
Sure. If you want more information about our organization, you can go to pbtx.com. That is the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. We have a blog. We also have a podcast called The Bell Post, thebellpost.com, where we address criminal justice issues. We've been doing that for almost 2 years, and we're rated in the top 10 of the 60 best criminal justice podcasts. So we address criminal justice issues. We have civil conversations, and I would just say there is hope. I mean, this is not sustainable. We can't continue on the path we are, and so we will have to have a change. And hopefully, it will be positive, and because we don't have any other choice.
Ken, I've got one more question for you. What do you say to the critics who say, "Of course, you're not for bail reform. You're a bail bondsman"? What do you say to those folks?
Well, I'm a bail bondsman attorney, but yes, I understand. Here's what I say to that. That's a better argument than what I normally hear from those groups. They would say you're a racist. You just want to put black people in jail, and you don't want to have. And so that just goes to identity politics. I don't listen to him because he is of this identity. I don't mind having any civil conversation. I'll argue anything you want about criminal justice reform, because to me, whatever is good for the criminal justice system is good for the bail industry because it's so intertwined. But I'll just end with what the mayor said, who was a Democrat mayor in an urban city. Until you have an alternative that is as effective with accountability than the private bail industry, then once you have that alternative, you can switch to that. But when you don't have an alternative and you're just releasing people with no accountability, that's a recipe for disaster. And so, okay, you're saying, oh, don't listen to him because he has the best system for getting people to court and has the highest accountability. I mean, we have the lowest failure to appear rate of any system in place in the United States. When you go to one of these others, they have at least a 50 or 100% higher failure to appear rate. So, yeah, I'll be happy to talk to you about statistics. I'll be happy to talk to you about success and what a successful program looks at. But if you're not willing to acknowledge those things, then, I would say, well, then why are you and I even talking? I mean, we've got to acknowledge the reason why. There's a reason why the bail industry's been around for 200 years. It does one thing and does it really good. And if you care whether people go to court, you want us in your system.
I think people on our side, we need to adopt the Obama phrase. You got to have skin in the game, right? That's what it's all about. You got to have skin in the game to make sure you come to court.
Well, and I think, I think there's a good story about that. And that is skin in the game is usually family. And, when all these other things have failed you, I tell my daughter, she's friends have a better influence on her than family. But I'm like, look, your friends are going to be the first to abandon you when you get in the criminal justice system multiple times. Your family will stick with you the longest, but you can even screw your family so much that they can't help you anymore. But the family involvement has the best chance of turning someone around to be productive, to change their thoughts on what they're doing. But if they get to the point where their families turn their backs on it, well, then they're career criminals and they need to stay in jail, because they're not in jail because they can't afford a bond. They're in jail because of their criminal history.
And that is a good note to end the conversation on. Ken, really enjoyed the conversation. We will put your bio and the link to your organization in the show notes on the podcast. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Water Cooler Politics. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.